Okay, welcome, Tim Cook. Probably the most well-known military historian in Canada today. You're with the Canadian War Museum, and as I understand, a professor at Carleton also. Um, Let me start off by asking you a personal question in the sense of your interest in military history and history in general. How it started. I mean, I assume you had two parents who were professors of history, so they must have cultured you as far as how fun history was.
Yeah, they did. Thanks. Yeah, it was a house of history, a house of books, thousands of books, great conversations. But like most teenagers, I wasn't really interested in history, and then my parents took me to the Western Front, and we visited the battlefields, the Somme, Vimy, Verdun, and that had an impact on me. Walking those cemeteries, walking the silent cities, looking at those headstones of those young men, teenagers, some of them, some overage, but of course the 16-year-olds and the 17-year-olds, that was the age I was at the time. That had an impact on me. And I came back, and it's not that I devoted myself to war history at that point, but I began to read more and I began to think about it more. And then was lucky to go to Trent University and the Royal Military College and other places, and to have great opportunities, all of which have sort of built upon my knowledge and my interest. And really, where I started was through the letters and the diaries of those soldiers, those men and women who served, the poetry they wrote, the prose. I suppose if you look at my body of work and writing, 12 books now, and another edited book, and my exhibitions at the War Museum, you see that, the voice of participants comes through, the eyewitnesses to history, those Canadian men and women who served, who sacrificed, who lost their lives, who came home. They're always at the forefront of my history, because I think that's the thing that got me interested first into the field.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I've actually I've been to the battlefields in Europe too, and it is impactful, very impactful. Um, I was actually quite astounded by the Vimy Memorial when I sort of first came upon it and walked up, and how big and impressive it is.
Yeah,
Um,
it's incredible, isn't it? I first went there when I was 17. I've been back. I've led battlefield tours. I've been there with my wife. I've been there with friends. Back with my extended family. I wrote a book on Vimy, as you know, in
yeah.
2017. I was lucky to be there as the historian for CBC with Peter Mansbridge, and it was an astonishing day, an epic day. 25,000 Canadians returning to Vimy Ridge in that 100th anniversary, and to be a part of that was really incredible. And to see the interest in our history, young people, there are about 12,000 high school students who had raised money to go overseas to be a part of that. I saw people there with T-shirts of great grandfathers who served, or great grandmothers, people with banners, people holding my own book, which was great. But it was really quite remarkable. And I think I wrote in my Vimy book, which the soft cover came out after that, so I was able to write an afterword, like, what other event in Canadian history has drawn 25,000 Canadians, 5,000 kilometers away from our country, to come together to think about a historic event. And that gives, I think, a sense of the power of Vimy. And of course, Greg, as you're saying, it's not just the battle, it's that memorial, it's that space, it's a place where we feel great pride and great sorrow together. And I always encourage people, if you have a chance sometime in your life, and you're Canadian, go to Vimy Ridge. You will be moved by it.
Yeah, it's interesting because the statues and the carvings on the memorial. Now, the last time I was at the War Museum, you actually had some duplicates, I think, in
Yeah,
there,
we do.
and oh yeah,
Yeah,
and just
Walter
looking at them in
Albert. Yeah, the
yeah,
great sculptor, of course, and I tell the story in my book. But we at the War Museum we have 17 of his 20 maquettes. So those of you who are watching this can sort of picture those sculpted figures around the memorial, and they have great symbolic meaning, and they're very powerful. They work, I think, with the memorial in so many ways. And for me, always it has been the grieving mother Canada, who is head bowed in sorrow and grief over her fallen sons and daughters. And at the War Museum, we do have those maquettes, and they were created by Walter Allward in his studio in England, and then brought over to the site where other master sculptors took them and doubled them in size, in effect. And they're what's there today, those memorials. And to see that link, I think, at our War Museum in Ottawa, to the memorial overseas, to the history that's all around us at the international level, at the national level, at the personal level, in our families, in our communities, I think is a very powerful link.
do you, just a side question here. Do you think? I mean, I think it was 1934 when they had the first return to Vimy with all the veterans and that, and then of course the 100th anniversary. Or do you think we'll have another event at Vimy that will be as impactful again at some point?
I'd like to think so. Um, Greg, yeah, it was 1936, July
Yeah.
1936, when 6,000 veterans went overseas, and we have periodically returned to Vimy in large groups, smaller groups, often as individuals. There's a new museum and interpretation center there. But your question is, will we return in such force as the 25,000 in 2017? I suspect not, but I wrote in the book Vimy that Vimy is always there waiting for us to return. It's a site of memory, a site of sorrow, a site of a pride, and we don't have to go in the thousands, and in fact Vimy is not a tremendously large space to go by the thousands, but it is an important place, I think, and we see that in our passport. It's on our passport and $20 bill, and we talk about Vimy in a very particular way in this country, all of which I think, I would like to hope that it will not disappear, that it will not lose its relevance, that we will tell this story and pass it down, not in a heroic chest thumping kind of way. We need to understand that the First World War was a profound event that forever changed Canada, also nearly split us and divided us like almost no other event in our history. Think of the conscription crisis, or the internment of Ukrainian Canadians, or the hardship that Canadians faced as more than 66,000 were killed and 170,000 Canadians were wounded. And nonetheless, it is our story. In my new book, The Fight for History, which is the third volume in my Second World War series, I talk about that, and I talk about Vimy as a story that we often tell and that many Canadians know about. But yet, strangely, for the Second World War, where even more Canadians served, we did a much poorer job in telling our story or building those memorials overseas or even in Canada.
Yeah, and just again, a little plug for your books here. I read several of them and have most of them, and you are a very, very easy read. You're a good writer. It's very descriptive, very exciting, hard to put down.
Thank
So
you.
there's your plug. Um, Let me ask you about the current state of, in one of your articles, you refer to it as modernist history, but regarding military history, where would you assess that we're at right now, and where are we going potentially?
Yeah, great question. And the study of history has gone through cycles over time. And I wrote my doctoral thesis on the study of Canadian military history. It became a book called Cleo's Warriors. And you know, the study of military history in this country went through a period from the 1960s where it almost disappeared from the academy, the universities, where it wasn't taught. It wasn't seen as important. I think when it was taught, we preferred to talk about peacekeeping, and of course that's a part of our military that's really important. I'm proud of our peacekeepers. I'm proud of our peacekeeping tradition, but we fought a lot of war in our history. If we just think of the 20th century alone, think of the South African War, the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Cold War, the Gulf War, 1990. Think of our mission and war in Afghanistan. Think of the 19th century, which is filled with warfare and survival. The 18th century defines the nature of the country, and indigenous warfare before that. So we can be proud of our peaceful traditions, as I am, but we're also a country that has been shaped by war. And I think, to come back to your question, we didn't do a great job in teaching that aspect of our history. I will say, I think over the last, since the 1990s, and I talk about this in my book, The Fight for History, where we had done such a lamentable job, such a poor job in teaching our history, especially about the Second World War, that we had almost reduced it to a series of disgraces and defeats. And I write in the book, like, there was no other country in the Allied world on the winning side that had fought in this absolutely necessary war, that had twisted its history in such a strange way. Having said that, since the 1990s, I think we have done a better job. We have more professors who teach about this in the university, to come back to your question. But in fact, it matters more in society, I think. Canadians matter more. We're doing a better job in telling our stories. And I'm very proud to say the Canadian War Museum, where I work as director of research, that museum opened in 2005, and it's visited by 500,000 visitors a year. And so it's a really important place to understand our shared past through that lens of military history. And yet I think there's always the worry that that these stories are being lost, that they are, as veterans pass away, especially from the Second World War generation, where we've lost most of them. What will we do to tell these stories and to pass them on to the next generation? That is a challenge that I think we all face.
So and that actually kind of leads into my next question, which has to do with Canadian universities. So you're feeling a little more optimistic about the academic environment in history departments as far as military history goes, or
We do have some great centers of scholarship. I think of Laurier University. I think of UNB, University of New Brunswick, the University of Calgary, the Royal Military College. And then there are other professors, Serge Derflinger at the University of Ottawa, and other places. And yet, I think it would be fair to say that military history is going through a period where a number of senior scholars are retiring and not being replaced. And so we'll have to see. And I really do hope that it will continue to be taught, certainly as part of a broader spectrum of courses, but also those specialized studies, I think, into the Great War or the history of veterans. I mean, just think about veterans as a group, the tremendous impact that they have had on Canada. 600, about 550,000 who survived the Great War, 1 million who survived the Second World War. I think around 500,000 who have served through the Cold War, peacekeeping, 40,000 in Afghanistan. These are Canadians from across the country. Every city, every town, every village has veterans, and they've had a tremendous impact. And we need to do a better job, I think, just in terms of scholarship, in understanding what that impact was and how they contributed to this country. That's just one area of scholarship that I see as requiring new research and new historians writing. And in my book, The Fight for History, I sort of offer some thoughts on where we might go and some areas that we need to focus on. But luckily, I'm not alone there. There are others also working in the field.
Okay, well, that's go back to your early years, and you mentioned Cleo's Warriors, and as you say, and as you've been talking about the Second World War and the First World War specifically, were huge events in Canada's history, informing who we are and where we're at and where we're going. But let me ask you about those official histories. Do they still form the basic starting point for anybody who seriously wants to take a look and study those, specifically those two wars? Is that
Yeah, I
still where
think
we
so.
should go?
I think so. The official histories, and just for listeners and watchers, it's a bit of a strange term, but those are service historians, usually in uniform, who were writing about the war almost immediately afterwards. And to compare the First World War to the Second World War is really interesting. In the First World War, we didn't do a good job in writing our history, and we really suffered for it. There was an official historian who was supposed to write an 8-volume history. He was a decorated veteran, but he was an engineer. He wasn't a historian, and he just simply couldn't do it. He was pulled in many directions, which I write about in my various books. And yet we didn't have that official history until it was written by another historian in 1962, G.W.L. Nicholson. And that classic, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, is really a starting point. And for those of you who know my 2-volume history at the Sharp End and Shock Troops, my goal was really to kind of update Nicholson's 1962 history, because it was out of print and it's about 600 pages and really thin. And it was written in a different style. There are very few experiences of soldiers. That's, as I mentioned at the top, as we talked about, Greg, that's what interests me. That how did they cope and endure? What was the culture of the soldiers, the social interactions? And I've written about that in my many books. And really, the Second World War is a mixed bag, but the Army was very lucky to have Colonel Charles Stacey, who wrote those histories, and I think they are the starting place. All of them, of course, are foundational texts. They weren't meant to be the last word. They were meant to be the first word, to allow the rest of us to move forward. And I've always felt indebted to those historians, having studied them very closely. Sometimes historians can take cheap shots. Oh, the official history on page 256 got it wrong. Well, okay, they were writing sometimes 2, 3, 5 years after the war event. They didn't know all the history. Think of that incredible literature that we have. And my 2 volumes on the Second World War, I counted at one point, I'd read over 1,000 books and memoirs for those two, just to understand those 2 books. Well, if you think of the official historians, they had almost nothing, nothing. So they were reconstructing it from those primary sources. And so that's why I talk about there is a debt that we owe there. They are the starting place. They're not the finishing place. Other historians, Mark Milner and Roger Sardi and Terry Kopp and Jack Granatstein, and the list can go on and on. They have brought those stories forward in terms of the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And some of those books, although they're out of print, I think if you go to the maybe it's the Department of National Defense, you can pull down the PDF files.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they,
they're worth reading, and
yeah,
folks, they'll repay those of you who maybe you're going to plan a battlefield tour. Maybe you'd like to follow a particular unit or regiment or First Canadian Army. Maybe you're going to Italy. The Nicholson history is still terrific for the Italian campaign. And yeah, I think that they, as you said, they continue to repay and offer guidance.
Now, let me ask you again a little bit more of a personal question. I think I know the answer to this one, but uh, if you were to choose one period of military history, Canadian military history, that's your favorite, what would it be?
Well, I think I started as a Great War historian, and I wrote a number of books there. And after I wrote my first book on gas warfare called No Place to Run, and Cleo's Warriors, and my 2-volume history, I began to move into the Second World War. And I find both of those wars absolutely fascinating. I've taught the entirety of Canadian military history, from Indigenous warfare to, the war in Afghanistan. And I think this is a key aspect of our history, our collective past. To answer your question directly, I, I, I perhaps feel more um, akin, it might be the wrong word, to the Great War, because I've read just tens of thousands of letters and diaries, and I find that fascinating. I guess I've done the same for the Second World War. One of the challenges on the Second World War, though, is it's so large, and with 1.1 million Canadians fighting and around the globe. Think of Hong Kong, think of Dieppe, think of the Italian campaign, the D-Day landings, the battles through Normandy, the clearing of the Scheldt, the liberation of the Dutch, the fighting into Germany, the naval war, the Battle of the Atlantic, the defending our coast, the Battle of the St. Lawrence when German U-boats came into the heart of country. Think of the multiple air wars and campaigns. It is a real challenge to simply even write about that. I did it in 1,000 pages in those two books, and yet I still felt that there was more that needed to be told. But um, that's the great thing about history. We do it in layers. We build upon the work of others. There's other venues. They could be academic or popular articles. I say in the fight for history, we didn't do a great job in telling this story. Why don't we have a documentary, a series of documentaries that tell us about Canada in the Second World War? That seems to be starkly missing when so many Canadians um, get their history from television. And, it's a great medium to understand our past if it's done right. Um, and so these are the challenges historians face. For me, I think it's less maybe about a time period, Greg, is that I like to tackle big books, the entire Great War through the Canadian perspective, the leadership of Sir Robert Borden and William Lyon Mackenzie King and Warlords, the writing of Canadian military history, the Vimy book and why it matters. I think maybe that might be how I would define myself, is I tend to to work from the scholarship and the hundreds of articles and books, but also my own research into the archives, which I love to research. And I suppose being a contributing historian for almost 30 years now, to tackle these big books, which I hope, as you mentioned so kindly, are both based on rigorous scholarship, but are also very readable, that there's a narrative there as well as
Yeah,
analysis.
and you know what? Actually, to jump down into the micro world too. Last week I was reading one of your articles about the negotiation of taking prisoners in the First
Right.
World War, and your the stories that you had and the research you'd obviously done into everything, and it became a fascinating world of the mental stress that these guys must have constantly been going through.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah, that's always been one of those questions for me of how did they survive? I mean, how did they cope? How did they endure? Why didn't they all break down from shell shock is in the First World War or battle stress? And to me, I keep coming back to those Canadians who served, those Canadians who were, for the most part, citizen soldiers in the two world wars. They were farmers and students and clerks and bankers. They were not professional soldiers, and they came from every community and most religions and all classes. And what is it about that experience that allowed them to keep moving forward in times, I think, that are very difficult for us to imagine? The experience in the trenches on the Western Front, or fighting through Italy with the Germans holding the best ground, or what it was like to be on a Corvette in the middle of the Atlantic, or in a Sherman tank in the Scheldt, or what, these are powerful stories of endurance and survival, and I've been exploring them in my various books and articles, in my exhibitions at the War Museum, which are always done with a team of other people. And I love that. I love being a public historian, is how I describe myself. I have a PhD in history, but I want to share these stories with all Canadians. And I've certainly been shaped by my work at the War Museum in thinking along those lines, where an exhibition is not meant for the other 25 PhDs in Canadian military history. It's meant for 125,000 Canadians. So how do you take those complex stories and and make them available and accessible while still being a rigorous academic. And that's the challenge that I have grown to love. And I do that in my museum work, and I do that, I guess, in my writing as well.
Okay, well, let's take that for a second and shift gears a little bit and say, okay, for any young people out there that are thinking of going to university and studying history, or graduate students that want to go on, what advice would you give them as far as the field goes, as far as best practices, as far as opportunities, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I love the study of history. I suppose you have to have a passion for it. There's a reason why you're devoting your time to the past. And most of the young people I've run into, I used to teach at Carleton, as you mentioned, and at the museum. There is a passion there. There's a spark. It comes from their families. It comes from their own reading. Maybe it comes from a historical film. Nowadays, I think there's other ways, museums and digital products and podcasts, but there has to be something there. And then I think it's passing through the university at the undergraduate level, and increasingly now at the master's level. And at that master's level, you're specializing in public history or Canadian history or Indigenous history or archives or libraries or museums or whatever it is. You become more specialized. And I think one of those really key things is to increasingly get a practicum or a placement somewhere in a community. And generally, it will be in a public history environment, an archives or a museum or a historical society. And I think to get that hands on experience is really terrific, because you need that educational foundation, that theoretical foundation that you get from the university. But it's also great to just figure out, what is it like to read 100-year-old letters and to preserve them and to make them, to think about the ways to make them available digitally, just to pick one example. Why do we collect things in museums? Why do archives, what is their function in society? If you're a filmmaker, go out there and start interviewing people and make a film. I think you've got to be doing it in some way. And I suppose for a very select few who move on to the PhD, there are different questions there. And with most of those people hoping to teach in the academy at the university level, it generally doesn't happen, and they will find other jobs in the history field. But it has been a good experience for me, I suppose. I started working at the National Archives in the mid 1990s. I've been doing this for 25 years, and it's been a day where it's been a life, I suppose, where every day I learn something new. Literally, I have encountered a lot of history in my time, as I imagine you have, and yet every day there's something new. At the War Museum, it's a new artifact, a new story, a new nuance, a new connection to put it together, a new experience, a new conversation that sparks something in my head to think about. And I think you do also need, if there's that passion on the front end, I might say, to finish up here on the back end, you need to have an inquiring mind. I guess you want to know why things happened in the past, and probably to connect it to the present we live in today. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, I always remember one of my first history profs basically said, "You're going to be a detective. That's what
Yeah,
you are."
yeah,
So,
that's a
um,
great phrase. Yeah,
yeah. Now, a couple of fun questions for you, because I know you did some surveys at various times with other historians. So
yeah,
and you talked a couple of times about films and making documentaries. I mean, I remember years ago, I was always impressed at the time by Canada People's History. I thought, that needed to do more of that. So let me ask you, you asked some fellow historians about their top 10 lists of films. And I'm not going to ask you for 10, but
yeah.
what are some of your favorite history films, military history films?
Oh yeah, yeah. That's, you can find that article in Canadian Military History, which is published out of Lorient, which is online. And if you're a real military history buff, they have 30 years of their journals online. And I don't know, Greg, there's probably like 400 articles there. And I think about 15 years ago, for fun, but also my own interest, I asked historians, what are your top 10 favorite or most important military history books? And it was a great time, and people really responded to that. Which are the core books that most of these, they were all professors, I think. Which are the ones people need to read? Now, this was 15 years ago, but people might want to check that out. As a follow-up, as you said there, Greg, I thought the top 10 military films, and that was interesting too, because so many people acquire their knowledge from films. And sadly, I think, to tie into my latest book, The Fight for History, we haven't done a great job in creating Canadian military history, call them fiction films or Hollywood films. We don't have a Spielberg in Canada, and we don't have the audience. And yet, I suppose there's Paul Gross and Passchendaele and a few other films where I think we have done a fairly good job in sometimes telling these stories, but we need to do more. Um, to just answer your question, I think for me, there are many types of war films, just as there are multiple books on war at the strategic level, at the tactical, at the personal, war on the home front. And in terms, I'll just pick one. In terms of combat and the combat experience, I think Saving Private Ryan, the first 27 minutes, has never been surpassed. It is shocking in its raw brutality, in its, I think, the capturing of that chaotic, bewildering combat experience of the gut-wrenching slaughter, and yet still the courage to get off those beaches. And that's an American story, but it was very similar on Juno Beach, where 3rd Canadian Division landed. And I think for raw intensity, that is something that is, just unsurpassed. And that's one I would point to. But I have many favorites. And when I used to teach at Carleton, I would occasionally show clips from these films, both to try to explore a concept, the Blue Max or something for the air war, or an aspect related to spying and espionage in the Cold War. And then it's fun to deconstruct these films of where the history they got it right or close, and where it's bananas, right? Like Pearl Harbor or something like that, where it's just, there's not a lot there that makes a lot of sense or is of any value for the historical context other than the entertainment value or some other aspect to it.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Let me ask you one final question here, and it has to do sort of with current society, the web, social media, and what I'm going to call, this is probably the most political question I can ask you right now, or I will ask you, but what I call the weaponization of history.
Okay.
And how we are seeing these cultural wars going on like crazy, and about all sorts of things. And it's almost like we're cherry picking various things from history, and the research that should be done on these things, and the rational, fully formed arguments are not, or positions are not being heard. The conversation is disappearing. It becomes point counterpoint. Do you think this is going to get worse, or do you think we're going to come back from this? Or
we are in a very difficult time. I think that phrase, the weaponization of history, I used it in my last book, The Fight for History. And on one hand, I think most of us who study history, who value history, um, like to see that it's not just left in the past, right? As a quaint thing to read on the weekend or when you're at the cottage. That the history in the past matters today, and I believe that's important for us as Canadians. And as I said earlier, I also don't think we should only be telling heroic history, the good stuff, the stuff that advanced us forward. We need to embrace the dark strain of history as well. We need to acknowledge when we as Canadians made mistakes. And yet now we do seem to be in a period very much of, if one was to say history should be encouraged, warts and all, it is now very much warts. I mean, we're in a dark period of looking for the people or the actions in the past where they have failed to live up to the standards of the present. And I suppose on one hand, that's okay if it's sort of history as warning or activist history where you're trying to use the past to try to complete an agenda in the present for good or for ill. And yet it's not really what historians do. When I talk about history, I always talk about it as, I'm attempting to understand the past in the context of the past. What did the people in the past, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 75 years ago, what did they think? What did they know? What could they have known? To take one stark example, they didn't live through the rights revolution of the 1980s that everyone in Canada has lived through and benefited from through the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, right? So it's a very different time. People thought differently. Should they all be condemned with broad brush strokes as being the monsters that some portray them as? I don't think that's terribly useful. The great historian, great Canadian historian Desmond Morton often talked about this of that's not history, that's some other form of activism, and perhaps to make us feel better about ourselves today. And so that's one strand. Another caveat, and of course, Greg, you ask a question to the historian, it's on one hand and the other hand and this hand and that hand. And if I can interject in one more back step, and let me just set the context for you here, and I better add a nuance there. The past is meant to be apprised, and to be evaluated. And the past and the facts don't change, but how we view them does change. And I think that's important. And each generation brings its own stories, its own questions. And something like if we were to take the statues and the monuments from the American Civil War, or in Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald, which can really excite a great sense of anger or need for change. These are questions that there were previous questions in the past. Think in Canada about Quebec and the various questions surrounding war, primarily conscription, or Ukrainian Canadians and internment, or Japanese Canadians and the official apology campaigns. These are questions with us. And of course, today, Indigenous Canadians and reconciliation, where the pathway forward is not always evident and clear, and that we will go through a period, many years, of grappling with these questions and trying to come to grips with them. And very much now, we see things playing out, I think, in the media, and as you've alluded to, Greg, in social media, immediate responses, perhaps not the same level of scholarship that if we had 5 or 10 years or 15 or 20 to reflect on, we might come up with different questions. But these two are part, I guess, the ebb and flow of history over time. So I've given you a bit of a sweeping answer there, and that I don't have the solution. I do think if there's one thing that we should think about, it's sort of that idea of that there will be different opinions on this, and that we should value different opinions, different approaches to the past, that the past means different things to different people, and that reconciling those views, I think, is important. And we want to do less shutting down and more opening up these debates and discussions. And I think that can be challenging when we're talking about heated topics that hurt, topics that have scarred, topics that have shamed. And yet I think there is no way forward without that kind of broader discussion and debate. And I hope that historians can play a part in that. They are well trained to do that. They can offer, I hope, grounded insights. And yet it won't be just the historians. It'll be what happens in museums and archives and historical societies and on blogs and on podcasts, and the list goes on and on. We are living through a fascinating period where there is so much information and knowledge that we really do have to work to figure out the voices from the cacophony. And I think if you're interested in a particular topic or theme, there's no shortage of information, but I think finding and listening and being willing to change your opinion, these are all important things. And I think this is often what the craft of history does for us. It allows us to think about these really complex issues, to understand them in a particular context, and sometimes to move forward in their contemporary society with positive solutions.
Well, it's nice to have a voice of wise moderation in addressing this topic instead of outrage. And so, Tim, I'd like to thank you very much. That was incredible. It's easy to listen to you forever and ever, but and hopefully we can do this again sometime. But again, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.